So hello everyone, and welcome to our last panel discussion of today. I think it will be one of the most interesting ones because we will try to answer the question whether digital citizens can save democracy. We have all been witnessing how digital innovation has been transforming democracies. At least I know I have been using more open parliamentary data here in Lithuania or mobile applications to see up-to-date information about decision-making processes around the world. But it would be very interesting to understand what are the advantages and disadvantages, and is there a future for digital democracy? So with no further ado, I'd like to ask Patrick to look back 5-10 years ago from now and compare it to our lives today. How far have we gone? Did we make huge steps forward or not really? And what would you say were the most valuable lessons so far? Patrick, if you could unmute yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
It will help for sure. So if we look back 5 or 10 years ago, I think that the most important thing that we have done so far is that for common people, the participation process for citizens have increased in the common knowledge of the people. And specifically in the political sphere, a lot of politicians are now aware that there is some kind of new democracy, direct democracy with direct contact with people. And this is, from my own perspective, a very big move because it will help, after all, to communicate directly with citizens, and more citizens are now aware that there is specific participatory process, new democracy engage directly with the citizen all across the world. It's not only in Belgium, not only in Europe. It's also in South America. It's also in North America. It's in Africa. It's in Asia. It's all democratic countries are now implicated into new kind of democracy, and that's for me a very big move since the last 5 years. And it's also enabled via all the social media, who helps a lot into communication directly with the people.
Thank you, Patrick. Since we are talking about the whole world, we have Rimvydas, who is Lithuanian, but on the other side of the Atlantic. Rimvydai, you are also a co-chairman of the Parliamentary Commission of the Lithuanian World Community. Thus, it would be very interesting to understand and to hear your experience. How can you participate in decision-making processes here in Lithuania while being abroad? And is online, is digital the only option to do that?
Thank you, Ieva, for having me today. Indeed, Lithuania is one of the few countries that has quite good representation and participation of diaspora in the parliamentary processes. So the commission that I co-chair, that has 10 diaspora representatives from different continents and 10 MPs, have been normally flying into Vilnius and having sessions for a week. And when COVID-19 came, we had to rethink that. And so very quickly we started having those sessions digitally, online. And it turned out to be quite well and effective. And it shows that we can adjust quickly. But when we look at large, we are nearing elections for the parliament in October. We see how quickly an incident like a pandemic can paralyze our democracy and especially diaspora participation in elections. Because in the past, the diaspora participated via usually mail-in ballots, and now we see that post offices and the whole system is getting slowed down or even paralyzed in some countries. Australia does not receive mail from many countries anymore. And so in the United States, where I'm currently based, post office is underfunded and they have their own elections to deal with. So that's why we immediately started raising electronic voting issue as a solution to that participation. And I have to say, I'm a bit proud that Lithuania acted quickly, sort of to address this issue, since we have a neighboring country, Estonia, as an example, and Parliament has passed legislation that would allow citizens abroad to vote electronically via internet. But at this point, we are still stuck. We are waiting for the solution to be heard, and 6 weeks are left until the election. So we moved quickly, but we have got stuck in implementation, and that shows that we were not ready to address pandemics. And that's a really mind-boggling thing, because pandemics are not anything new. It's not like arrival of aliens on Earth. And we are not even talking about Spanish flu or pandemics that happened a long time ago. We had Ebola, we had H1N1, we had SARS. It's strange that we did not prepare for a pandemic type situation, and we were so arrogant to think that we can always defeat it in developed and developing world.
Thank you, Rimvydas. I think e-voting is one of those topics that you cannot avoid while talking about digital democracy. But probably we should also talk about citizen engagement all year round. And we have Pablo here today, who is a board member of Desidem, an innovative online tool of participatory democracy. Pablo, how this idea came into light? How was it born? And do you think that those kind of tools, participatory tools online, can actually engage citizens better?
Yeah, well, that question makes me think about the first question, like how were we located 10 years ago? So when I was thinking 10 years ago, and it's part of the roots of the Desidem project, we were living like a wave of mobilization motivated by the lack of trust in democratic institutions. Thinking about the Arab Spring, the 50-man movement in Spain, Occupy Wall Street, José 132 in Mexico, Occupy Getty, like those times there was like a real lack of trust in democratic institutions. And I think that problem still persists and explains many of the phenomena we are living. But one way to provide trust in these institutions and in the democratic agencies that we have is to incorporate the participation of citizens and to be able to co-create public policy. And so the Desidem as a project emerged from the 50-man movement, like all the techno-political ecosystem around that movement that they were claiming of trying to get advantage of the capabilities of digital technologies to strengthen democracy by citizen participation. So there was one specific moment in Barcelona when there was a transition that a grassroots party that emerged from the movement won the elections. There was a need to make a new strategic city planning because it's mandatory that the strategic city planning of the Catalan cities have to be done by citizen participation. but there was like a need to use digital technologies to really scale up participation and to allow like the citizens of Barcelona to massively co-create the strategic city planning. So that was the origin of Desidem, a platform for participatory democracy that it was launched by the City Council of Barcelona, but now is available in many other cities like Helsinki, many cities in France, Mexico City, soon New York, but also in regions like Catalonia, countries like France, Belgium, Italy, the European Union, but not only like political institutions, but also like organizations like universities, human rights organizations, and so on. So it's a project that starts real from like all this movement around on this techno-political ecosystem to try to bring the capabilities of technology to scale up participation and in the end to strengthen democracy.
Thank you, Pablo. And I think talking about participatory democracy also kind of very nicely links to deliberative democracy. I think probably there are some similarities, but also differences. And we have Mauricio, who is an expert in it with his OECD team. Thus, Mauricio, if you could tell us a little bit about what is deliberative democracy and what do you think? Digital tools, can they enrich it or not?
Yes, well, thank you. Yes, what we did, we launched at the OECD a report in June, so in the middle of the pandemic and in the middle of physical distancing, we launched a report, the first international report on deliberative democracy, and more specifically on representative deliberative processes, which in a nutshell, it's when a randomly selected group of people that kind of represent society or a community spend some time learning, collaborating, and deliberating in order to give recommendations to policymakers. So this can be, for example, the Irish Citizen Assembly that proposed a referendum on abortion or in equal marriage. It can also be the French Citizen Assembly that focuses just on climate change policies. And so this is deliberative democracy, and it's part of participatory democracy. It's a way that we can engage citizens. I will not get into a lot of details, and we can share the link to the report for people that are more interested in getting to know more. But so what we were interested in is to actually, what you ask, can digital support, enhance, or is it a risk to deliberation? And we started analyzing this because the pandemic happened and because many processes couldn't happen in real life because people couldn't meet. And so with the question of how long is this going to keep going, we start analyzing and looking at how some processes were first moved from physical to online, and others were from scratch created in an online environment, and others were kind of hybrid using both things. And for that, we published already 10 articles on a series that is called Digital for Deliberation. And the idea is that we gather evidence, we gather information, and then we were able to share the learnings from this on how to better use, how is it being used, and what should we all do for digital to really support deliberative democracy.
Thank you, Mauricio. And it seems to me that now while we are talking that digital is all good, that during the pandemic, we came up with really innovative ideas or we made some steps forward. But going back and looking back this half a year during the COVID-19 crisis that hit us, were there any challenges regarding the move towards digital democracy that we also encountered? Patrick, if I could circle back to you, what do you think? Is it all just advantages with digital democracy during pandemics when everyone is locked up, let's say at home? Or do we also witness any challenges that were coming from this?
Unmute myself. Sorry, but I think we must not forget the fact that digital democracy, it's only a part of the direct democracy, of the new kind of the democracy. It happens in real life. So people gathering in order to discuss about things are also a very big part of participatory process. And with the pandemic, what we've seen, so we launched to participative budget, for example, in Brussels, by the way, by using the Desidem platform, actually. And so thank you, Pablo. So we are a great fan of it. So when we launched that, it was just before the pandemic, it was in January. What we saw is that during the first 2 months, so all the meetings and gathering were scheduled in order to meet the people in different locations in the city. Without that, it was a lack of new or other kind of participation. It seems that it's more focused on the people who have good connection, good know-how, who knows already what's participatory process. And it's kind of always a usual suspect. So male, above 40, well-educated. So it's not it's interesting, but we lost a part of the feedback and the interaction with other kind of people who can, who can directly meet the people for the project on specific meetings or on malls and direct interactions. And so we lost that specific information, and probably we lost some kind of new other projects, other kind of.
Thank you, Patrick. And Pablo, have you seen similar trends as well?
Yeah, well, it's quite relevant what Patrick just said, because we're talking about here about digital democracy, but personally, I'm interested in democracy as a concept. Like, we can use digital tools to strengthen democracy, to scale up the number of participants that can be in remote places, collaborating asynchronously, but we are talking about democracy. So these are platforms like Desidem are platforms that are aimed at facilitating participatory process for democracy, but not only for digital democracy, because many times where we are talking about using technology for this purpose, one of the main questions, and I understand that is one of the main questions, about the digital divide. Like, what will happen with the people that they don't have access to the internet, or they don't have the skills to get a proper use of those technologies. But as Patrick said, there are many other divides that are quite relevant, like, for instance, the participatory divide. Like, there are some specific type of citizens that are much more used to be involved in participatory processes, no matter they are offline or they are online, because they have the knowledge, and sometimes they are even experts on how to get benefit from this open process, that in the end they get much more power than some minorities or maybe majorities that are underrepresented. So I think one of the key aspects from the very beginning of the Desidem was trying to understand, like, this is not a project of digital democracy, and this is not a project of online democracy. Like, an online platform should not replace the existing participation in the city or in the territory. Okay, so there should be a platform to facilitate that the communities that are already participating and the communities that are not participating get involved, because of adding this new channel. That this shouldn't be like an alternative channel, but an hybrid approach. So, for instance, in the case of the first process, the strategic city planning, over the 3 months of the process, there were like more than 400 meetings in the city, in markets, in civic centers and spaces, that people who were not used to be involved in this participatory process, they were able to discuss proposals for strategic city planning, to discuss the existing proposals in the platform, to support them, to add comments, but also to create new proposals that they went to the platform. So instead of having two separate channels, the offline and the online, trying to use the online to facilitate and reconfigure the settings of the existing offline dynamics of participation in the city.
Thank you, Pablo. Mauricio, but do you think that going digital and using online tools actually helps to include more citizens, or we can see only a different kind of exclusion of various groups, because we have people who don't, for example, have access to the internet, to name but a few?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it depends on how and for what we use digital. Because what we're learning from all of these experiences that we're observing of using digital for deliberation, for example, and we observe deliberative processes, but we also observe, for example, deliberation in parliament, deliberation in the justice system, because we think that we can gather some knowledge and some good practices from across the spectrum how democracy is being performed by using digital tools. And one of the first learnings is it's very important to first know and decide how to use digital, because digital doesn't replace, as Pablo and Patrick already said, they cannot immediately and automatically replace social interaction, for example. And that's a big challenge, especially for deliberative processes and for processes where social communication, how people interact between each other, how consensus is being reached. Digital, it's important to very well design the tool. So design in terms of how do we communicate? For example, here we're in Zoom, and there's one way that we communicate. It's, well, two ways, by video and voice, but also by text. And this gives a whole perspective on how democracy is being exerted. Other platforms like Facebook, for example, it's mainly chat. And these kind of designs of the digital tools are very important when we talk about how democracy is exercised. These are some of the learnings that we're gathering, and especially it's that there's not a one size fits all in terms of digital tools. So we saw during the pandemic that Zoom or kind of Zoom applications, whether it's another type of tools, were used everywhere. But we never really ask ourselves, is this the tool that we need for the democratic process that we're doing? And I think that's one of the main learnings that we maybe take from out of this pandemic, is that we need to think, what are we going to use the digital tools for? Are we going to use them as a support? Are we going to use them as the whole process embedded? Are we going to use it for transparency of the process, for reaching a bigger audience, and so on? So depending on how do we use digital, then we can ask ourselves how to avoid exclusion. If it's digital divide, okay, let's invest in accessibility, in giving, I don't know, tablets and infrastructure to people. If we're talking about participatory divide, we need to give skills to people to be able to participate, and so on. So to briefly answer your question, the exclusion also depends on how we're using digital. And that's maybe one of the big learnings that we'll take out from this pandemic.
Thank you, Mauricio. And it's very interesting how you touched upon this question of what is a goal of going digital and having those all innovative tools and innovative online solutions. I saw in Lithuania that, for example, during the pandemic, the conversation about electronic voting very quickly moved forward, even though we have been talking about it for years. And Rimvydas, I would like you to share your experience, whether there were any other steps that you saw COVID-19 brought as a good experience, as an advantage, whether our decision makers actually were more open to different solutions that they've previously been.
For a long time, when we leave the decision to move to the next step or implement something, the discussions go on and on and on. But when you are faced with a threat like COVID-19, it seems like you have no choice but to act. And that's where we saw most of the progress to happen. People said, we cannot move to online teaching. We cannot move to online lecturing. We cannot teach older people to order food online, and they need to be provided with options. And then suddenly, within 2 weeks, everyone was shopping online. Everyone was putting their kids at the computers to take lessons and learn. And that shift happened very quickly. Unfortunately, that shift is not happening as quickly in the participation of democracy, right? There we see more discussions about the threats. Well, cybersecurity might be a threat. People might be manipulating this process. And I feel like there we get stuck very quickly again. In May already, more than 50 countries have either canceled or postponed elections. So that means we stall democratic process in the free world because we did not have tools to actually move on with the process, right? And so when we think about sort of more complex and engaging participatory processes, And those are very important for democracy. But we actually come short at the very basics when it comes to participation. We don't have infrastructure to engage people, even in a simple one action to vote. Lithuania has to register voters who vote abroad every single time. We just had elections last year, and so we're having it this year again. So it's very easy to compare. In one case, we had an option to meet and mingle and talk to each other, and in the other, it's very limited. And we see drastically the results. So one thing that all speakers have mentioned, you cannot change the social interactions value. It's very important. Even for a simple action like register to vote, now we see that registrations are low because people in schools, in churches, in meetings are not happening because they are all online. And you cannot do that via Zoom as candidly, as engagingly as we did last year. So that's a drawback. And even though initially we saw sort of engagement, excitement, and we were able to reach more people online, organizing events, and actually people saved time. They did not have to travel across the borders. Now we actually see fatigue. So that's one of the probably drawbacks of the digital democracy, that fatigue is settling in now that novelty is going away. So how do we overcome that? But of course, in some cases where citizens never were able to vote, for example, Lithuanians in Latin America, they register every single time because they can do that, but then the mail never comes with ballots, or if it comes 2 weeks later after the election. So it doesn't matter anyway, it's only frustrating. So in those situations, we need to put something that works, and we have solutions. Internet works. And one thing that I would caution, more and more people are talking about the exclusion of voters, but it's a very important question, but for longest time, the younger generation, for whom things don't exist unless it's on internet, they were excluded primarily because of their habits and culture.
Thank you, Rimvydas. And it's very interesting that you touch upon the lack of resources, the lack of capacity. Sometimes there are people and activists who want to move forward, but then somehow we always get those excuses from the public sector, for example. So from your experience, Patrick, Pablo, Mauricio, what are the tips and tricks, let's say, to move forward and to understand that you are moving forward successfully? So in other words, how we can know that digital tools that we are proposing to our governments, public administrations, are actually successful and we are actually making a change. Patrick.
So the first thing is that I'm not only a big fan for open standard tools, but I'm also a very big fan of the implication of the state into a participatory process. So digital democracy is one single part of the global democracy, and as such, all the governments are responsible of it. So we could not say that democratic processes should be handled by a private company, for example, or by NGOs. It helps, sure. It helps to move forward, to scale the process, that's for sure. But in order to provide exactly seamless self-process everywhere to everyone with the same accuracy and the guarantee that all the data are not used after all, that the security of the process is guaranteed, that this is a total transparency in the algorithm and total transparency in the coding of the tools, because it's very important. It's a question of trust. The people should be able to trust not only the process, but the tools itself. And so that's, from my own perspective, and that's also the position of my government, it's the role of the government to help the people, and so to provide tools to guarantee that the tools used are free of security issues, are maintained, are supported, and that they provide most of the time freely all the process needed in order to interact with the people. That's for me a very big move. That's a very key metric. I don't want to be that we measure the democracy and the digital democracy by numbers, by how many people are using it. It's also a question of, it's not a quantitative but qualitative metrics. Is that and it starts top down. The government should provide all the local administration, all different kind of administration, to have tools in order to interact with the people and in their own way, specifically. But the tools must be provided and must be maintained, must be guaranteed by the state, just like another kind of process of democracy. And they should guarantee that the process is completely free and that there is no money in it. That's very important. People must understand that when they participate into this kind of digital democracy, it's not about selling something or selling a tool or using data. Not at all. Because if they want to, they can use Facebook for that, or Instagram. If they want to, they make poll on Facebook, and I'm sure that 80% of all the people in the country could make a polling directly on Facebook. But the question is, what about all the data? That's not the case if this kind of digital democracy is running by states. That's from my perspective very important, and it's really changing the ballpark of the game.
Mauricio, and what do you think about it? Is it top down or bottom up, the perspective that we should be looking at?
I totally agree with Patrick. I think, obviously it has to be a top down, and what I will add just to what Patrick said in terms of what the state or the government has to do. It's the institutionalization part of the process, because what we're looking here, we should focus on the process itself and then question how to make it digital and how to make it digital that works. But the main question should be, how is this process designed? What are the results? Are we giving feedback to the citizens? How is it embedded in the decision-making process? And then we can open the discussion on, okay, so how do we make this process digital? And sometimes a lot of participatory processes and administration start the question the other way around. We want a digital tool that is very fancy, very well designed, but they never ask about how is this institutionalized and how is this answering the needs of the citizens and the needs of the government. So I think that part of institutionalization and of, let's say, design of the process, it's very important. And the last, all of this open by design and ethical design of the tools is very important. And the only bottom-up thing that I would add, and that I think I can link and then give the word to Pablo, is that we need communities also of users, but also of designers and of tech communities that are here to propose new tools and to exclude the big GAFAs out of this. And especially, for example, if I focus on deliberation, where it's the purpose of our research at the moment, is because we don't have tools that can answer the needs of the deliberative processes. We don't have tools that allow to make these kind of connections. We don't have tools that allow for people to engage properly in a consensus-based decision-making. And for example, a very interesting idea that we could look at a little bit more is the gaming community, because the gamers give us a lot of evidence on how social interactions can be built online, how can users that are not anonymous are pseudonymous. So very important to be able to have trust in who you play with. These kind of things are very important when it comes to deliberative democracy, and things that we can learn as policymakers, but also the governments can learn from these communities to implement digital democracy practices.
Thank you, Mauricio. And Pablo, what is your take on that?
Well, I totally support what Patrick and Mauricio just commented. I also believe that there is sometimes some fetishism about the usage of innovative technologies and about big numbers of participants in participatory processes. But we should remember, when we're talking about democracy and when we're talking about politics, it's about social transformation. Like, the goal of getting involved is to make meaningful transformation of our lives, of societies, and our ways of living. So I believe that citizen participation could be a very valid approach and a very interesting approach to activate collective intelligence and to improve decision making of governments and institutions. So I think like having tools to facilitate citizen participation can be of interest, because we should remember that the cost of using technologies, but using any kind of methodology, is not trivial. The cost is high. So institutions should be aware of the practical benefits of using one technique or the other, one technology or the other. So when I'm thinking about using digital technologies, and in particular free open source digital technologies like Desidem, but many others, it's about then they can bring to these institutions the possibility to have like transparency, traceability, and accountability of their processes. So the cost of using technologies to facilitate participation is then it helps for the documentation of the process, and also to account for the results and to the progress and the implementation of the projects that have been decided in these processes. And in relation with the last comments said by Mauricio, remembers there is this recent study by Nardin Almer in the Center of the Liberative Democracy of the University of Canberra, that she was talking about top-down approaches in mini publics, concluding that sometimes they can be undemocratic, and technological solutions in oral deliberation can be undemocratic as well, because even if they are open or participatory, like the experts are the ones who are dictating the process. So when we are talking about using digital technologies in democracy or digital democracy, we have to consider who is dictating the process and who is dictating the technology that is being used. Which are the features that we want, with the specific design that we want of the technologies for participatory and democratic processes. And one way to do that democratic is to have, as Mauricio say, a community, because of course, like the software has to be free and open source, because if platforms are not free, they are not transparent, and if they're not transparent, by definition, they cannot be democratic. But having like the code open is not enough. Like if the code is open, but in the end the decision about how the technology is built is taken by the same group of people, and group of people that are similar to these experts in participation that Patrick was saying in a comment before. Like in the end, all these platforms are mostly designed by male, well-educated people, like the ones of this panel, I should say, as well. But so I think it's interesting to incorporate participatory design, like to build communities that co-design how the platform should evolve or not. Otherwise, we are just opening participation, but we are not opening how participation must be, or the kind of participation we want as a society.
Thank you, Pablo. And since our time, unfortunately, is running out, I would like for you to make one wish, each of you, and just think about how would you like decision-making processes to look like in 2, 3, or 4 years. So I'll just start with Rimvydas. Just one sentence, 2 sentences. What is your wish?
Actually, Ieva, can I respond very quickly to what the speakers just addressed, and then I'll think about one sentence wish.
Sure. Very briefly, thank you.
Very briefly, we talk about the data privacy and the need for anonymous participation in some cases. I think it's very important to remember that some people are willing to share their data, or they don't care. They talk openly about their positions, about their thoughts every day with global world. And so we should not use that as an excuse to stall some of the attempts, experimentation, as long as digital tools are in addition to other tools, and we are able kind of to unify it in the more comprehensive deliberation process. So I think waiting until we implement one standard so everyone is protected, anonymous, might not be necessarily the best way to move forward.
Thank you. So whoever has a wish and a final takeaway from this session for our viewers and listeners, please go ahead. Mauricio.
Because no one wants to take the risk. No, I guess my wish goes, and I'll just take the title of this session, that is, can digital citizens transform democracy or save democracy, I think. And I think my wish is that we need to look at digital, and it's very important. And I think that all the questions that we raise during this panel need to continue, and we will have more problems and new questions will arise. But we should focus on the process itself and how democracy is being changed by how we embed citizens in the decision-making process. And I think if we focus on that, and if governments, but also citizens, civil society, and the whole society itself focuses on how are we giving more voice and more power to citizens to participate in the decision-making process, and that reflects on the processes that we're organizing, that's my wish. If we all collectively do that, then the digital tools that will allow for that will follow, and we can have discussions on how to design, how to protect, how to build those tools. But that conversation doesn't matter if the process itself, it's not participatory or impactful enough for citizens to engage.
Thank you. Patrick.
Well, I think that the big move, the big change that could happen in digital democracy is that all the politicians, all the deputies all across the world take into account the fact that they could add to indirect democracy, a direct democracy, to help them in order to build a new government process, who integrate directly, but not only, but directly the people into the discussion itself. A fact that the politician can take that into account and see that like an opportunity of democracy, and in order to involve more people, enlarge the process itself. We are not in the 19th century anymore, not even though the 20th century anymore. And so people wait to something else, something more direct, where they are implicated. And so if the politicians all across the world can take that into account, it will be a very big move into democracy, and it will change it a lot.
Thank you, Patrick. Pablo, one sentence.
Okay, so I think that in the same way that we cannot imagine now democratic governments without being the result of an election process, I wish that in a few years we won't be able to imagine decision making and policy making without being the result of participatory processes.
Thank you, Rimvydas. And what is your wish?
My wish that in a few years, as quickly as possible, citizens all over the world would participate easily, safely, regardless of the challenges that we are facing, whether it's new pandemic or displacements from other catastrophes, massive migrations, ecological disasters. We should be able to elect governments, participate in decision-making without interruption, because the digital platforms allow us to do that. So in global world where we all migrate, one day we are here, another day in another place, maybe because of work, because of studies, maybe because of some challenges that we are facing, we should be able to practice democracy freely, easily, and safely.
Thank you very much, Rimvydas. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Patrick and Mauricio. It was very interesting to hear your insights, and I guess we will not avoid digitalization, and we should not, but we would definitely, everyone participate in the processes and have our own say. So thank you for a very insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.